Chicago Center of Paris. I mean, my presence talking here is totally unnecessary, but I did want to thank the organizers of this conference, Paul, Elodie, Paul, and Sebastian. I just wanted to thank them for organizing this, for everybody. There's a kind of visible transformation of the entire space of the center, which is incredibly nice to see, and a wonderful meal that is out back and in the garden. So the only thing I would fault the organizers with is there's not a panel on the punk rock scene in Minneapolis. It's just where I grew up, seeing bands like The Replacements and Husker Du. So, but maybe I should have provided, jumped into the breach or something like that. But at any rate, so that's more or less all I have to say, but just my real gratitude for the effort at organization. And where's Travis as well? The effort at organization and just the wonderful numbers of people showing up. So I know that you got off to a really good start yesterday with the conference, and so I wish you all the best for last week. Okay? Thank you very much. Now I give it over.
Alors, bonjour à tous, merci d'être là pour cette seconde journée du colloque Disorder, Histoire sociale des mouvements punk et post-punk. Pour cet atelier sur donc les espaces punk dans la ville. Moi je m'appelle Jedediah Flower, je suis un membre de l'équipe de Volume, la revue de musique populaire, qui est la seule revue française dédiée à l'analyse des musiques populaires. Je fais un peu ma promo. Hein. Pour ceux que ça intéresse, il y a des numéros qui sont sur la table au fond, notamment un numéro sur la presse alternative qui traite du coup beaucoup des mouvements punk, des numéros sur la contre-culture où il y a pas mal de choses sur le mouvement punk, mais j'arrête là. La self-promotion, et je cède tout de suite la parole à Baptiste Collin, avant que Elodie, tu veuilles dire 2-3 mots peut-être. Non. Donc moi je suis juste président de séance, et je cède tout de suite la parole à Baptiste Collin, donc de l'université Paris-Ville-Rose, de CMURCI, qui va nous parler des milieux squatteurs. Eddie Lefebvre, bon, très bien. Et qui va nous parler donc des milieux squatteurs à Berlin-Ouest et à Paris au début des années 80.
Merci, bonjour à tout le monde. Je vais entrer tout de suite en matière. En fait, tout d'abord, je vais m'excuser pour ceux qui attendaient un PowerPoint. Moi, j'en ai pas fait, donc peut-être certains qui seront contents. Et pour ceux qui veulent voir éventuellement des images de squat, d'abord, on en trouve beaucoup sur Internet aujourd'hui. Et j'ai amené quelques bouquins que je montrerai aussi, qui font partie des matériaux que j'ai utilisés pour préparer ma communication. Que j'ai intitulé Zonar, Anar, Toto, Alternos et les punk, avec un point d'interrogation. Les milieux squatteurs à Berlin-Ouest et Paris entre 1980 et 1983. Alors en introduction, d'abord moi je suis historien, donc je prépare une thèse actuellement en histoire, sur l'histoire des squats comme mode d'action en fait, ce qui me permet de m'intéresser vraiment à la pratique, toutes les pratiques qui sont liées en fait au phénomène des squats, et donc au mouvement squatteur au pluriel. Je fais l'histoire contemporaine évidemment. Je m'intéresse à la période de 1945 à 90. Et donc ces 3 années que je vais présenter aujourd'hui et surtout la scène punk, sont une partie très infime de mon travail général. On a entendu hier Thomas Loué qui nous a parlé un peu des problèmes méthodologiques qui sont liés au travail historiographique. Et il a notamment évoqué le fait que voilà, le matériau primaire des historiens, c'est les archives, ce qu'on appelle aussi des sources. Et moi, la différence justement de lui, qui a travaillé sur OTH, pour ceux qui étaient là hier et ils l'ont entendu, il a fait moi, j'ai pas justement fait de manière consciente le choix de ne pas aller à la rencontre de squatteurs, même si j'en ai rencontré plusieurs qui m'ont raconté des choses, mais j'ai pas fait d'interview, d'entretien, etc. parce que je partais du principe que pour englober le phénomène dans sa globalité, il fallait pas seulement interviewer les squatteurs, mais aussi toutes les personnes qui sont impliquées dans le phénomène, c'est-à-dire des policiers, des avocats, des membres d'associations, des voisins, des membres de la municipalité, du gouvernement même éventuellement. Et comme sur beaucoup de choses, j'aurais eu des impasses, surtout sur la grande période que j'étudie, j'y ai renoncé. On s'est intéressé jusqu'à maintenant, au cours de ce colloque, beaucoup aux groupes de musique, et finalement assez peu au public, même si on l'évoque sans arrêt. On s'est intéressé aux postures, punk, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, à l'attitude, à l'engagement, au militantisme, et finalement on s'est assez peu intéressé au domaine de l'intime. Finalement, les punks, où est-ce qu'ils habitent, on pourrait se demander. Qui sont-ils à la maison? Qui sont-ils chez eux? En gros, donc, les questions auxquelles que je vais évoquer aujourd'hui, sans forcément apporter des réponses très précises, c'est qui sont les squatteurs, qui sont les punks, et donc, plus précisément, qui sont les punks squatteurs. À partir de là, je me suis posé donc la question, comment on peut identifier des lieux qui sont a priori intimes, fermés, qui abritent, qui regroupent des personnes qui sont caractérisées collectivement par un style de musique au départ. Donc la musique punk, la culture punk, etc. Donc après une courte présentation du cadre analytique un peu sur lequel je travaille, je présentais évidemment la situation à Paris, ensuite à Berlin-Ouest, et je ferai une sorte de synthèse comparative. Au cours de la journée et demie qui a précédé la séance de maintenant, on a parlé plusieurs fois des squats. Je vais quand même, je pense, apporter des choses nouvelles, mais il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont déjà été dites, donc je vais les répéter. On a parlé beaucoup des concerts dans les squats. Mais j'ai fait le choix de ne pas aborder la définition des squats. Qu'est-ce qu'un squat finalement? Et en même temps, je tiens à souligner le fait que ce qu'on entend aujourd'hui par squat est assez différent de ce qu'on entendait à l'époque. Et notamment, ce matin, on a parlé du fait que la miroiterie était un squat, et en même temps, on a dit qu'il avait une convention précaire. À l'époque, en 81, c'est le point qui m'a beaucoup intéressé, en 1981, il n'est pas question de convention précaire. Les squatteurs sont dans une démarche ou dans un statut d'illégalité absolue. Quand ils sont dans ces lieux, ils sont dans des lieux qui sont illégaux, enfin les occupants illégaux. Voilà. Du coup, je vais commencer par ça en citant un extrait d'une autobiographie de Eva Bruder qui s'appelle Verpisst euch, qui veut dire allez vous leur foutre. Sex and Drugs and Hardcore Punk. Et dans la préface de son autobiographie, donc, qui a été publiée en 2005, donc une punk de Berlin-Ouest et ancienne squatteuse se présente en ces termes. Deux points ouvrez les guillemets. J'ai vécu 4 ans dans les squats. Pendant cette période, je n'ai pas eu de relations sexuelles, je n'ai pris aucune drogue, je n'ai pas fumé et n'ai jamais bu d'alcool. Mon alimentation était équilibrée, régulière, c'est pourquoi j'étais en parfaite santé. Je m'habillais pour passer inaperçu et comme il faut. Mes cheveux étaient toujours bien coiffés, avec une règle bien droite et bien propre. Je me lavais chaque matin et me brossais les dents 3 fois par jour. Ma chambre était exemplaire et toujours impeccablement rangée. Je me suis toujours comporté avec discrétion, obligeance et humilité à l'égard des autres gens. Si l'on me frappait à la joue droite, je tendais la gauche. Je n'ai jamais eu de problème avec la loi et je votais ses dégoûts. Mes amis étaient exactement comme moi, notre foi en l'État était sans comparaison. Tout le monde nous aimait. Nous nous entendions parfaitement avec nos familles, nous exercions un travail régulier, avions de l'argent et envisagions l'avenir avec assurance. Chaque dimanche, j'allais à l'église, et chaque soir, en me couchant de bonne heure, j'ai récité notre Père à genoux. Mon unique rêve était de trouver un mari convenable et de bonne famille, de fonder une famille, d'avoir 2 ou 3 enfants, une propriété à la campagne, et de partir chaque été en vacances dans la forêt noire. Mon pire cauchemar était de me faire remarquer. Qu'en penseraient les voisins? Je voulais servir la société, et si nous ne sommes pas morts, alors nous vivons encore aujourd'hui. Comment s'appelle cette figure de style? Le cynisme, la satire, l'antiphrase? Je dirais que c'est pire, c'est finalement un anti-texte, c'est une anti-définition. Et finalement, c'est bien de ça dont il s'agit, puisqu'on parle des punks. Mais la trame de fond du sujet, ce sont les mondes des squats. Les mondes des squats en référence à un ouvrage qui a été publié par Florence Bouillon, qui a travaillé sur l'anthropologie des squats à Marseille. Le monde des squats, moi j'appelle ça les mondes des squats, il y a tellement de squats finalement différents, qui est un paysage urbain incontournable pour qui s'intéresse à l'histoire locale des capitales européennes, ou même aux grandes villes de manière générale, ou aux pratiques culturelles et politiques des dominés, des contestataires, des rebelles, des exclus, des reclus. J'ai j'emploie moi le terme de milieu punk, on a parlé de scène punk. Je ferai une petite différence, on pourrait schématiser ça en gros. Une scène, c'est un endroit sur lequel des personnes défilent. Le milieu punk, par là j'entends le fait qu'il y a des personnes qui rentrent, qui sortent, et que du coup il y a une certaine sorte de centre, et quelque chose qui regroupe un peu tout le monde. Du coup, on s'interroge sur le fait, est-ce que réellement ces milieux punk existent, ou est-ce qu'ils ont vraiment existé? Évidemment, il est question de s'intéresser à des espaces particuliers dans lesquels gravitent et évoluent des populations qui sont identifiées comme punk. A priori, chacun ici, je pense, a une image assez précise de ce que sont les punks, ou ce qu'ils ont été, de ce qu'ils représentent. On a certainement également une idée du type de lieu qu'ils fréquentent, même si on s'intéresse uniquement à la scène musicale. Et on parvient même à s'imaginer le type de lieu dans lequel ils vivent, et justement, c'est là la question. Parce que si les punks du début des années 1980 n'avaient pas tous des crêtes ou des cheveux décolorés, comme on pourrait en avoir l'image aujourd'hui, quand on voit quelqu'un comme ça, on dit qu'il est punk. Après, on croise n'importe qui dans la rue, on ne sait pas. Est-ce qu'il se définit lui-même comme punk sans en avoir l'air? On ne sait pas. Donc si les punks à l'époque, n'avaient pas tous donc les crêpes, les cheveux décolorés, les ailes à la nourrice, des vêtements déchirés, alors dans ce cas-là, comment on peut les reconnaître? Et du coup, comment les historiens peuvent les reconnaître? Ou alors, on peut reconnaître, identifier comme punk uniquement ces personnes qu'on voit telles quelles, comme je les ai décrits, sur des clichés photographiques, dans des reportages télévisés. Et évidemment, si on a l'avantage qui se sont eux-mêmes affirmés comme punk, alors ça permet de faire une entrée pour s'intéresser plus précisément à qui ils ont été. Ou alors, il faut qu'on leur ait donné la parole ou qu'ils l'aient prise. C'est-à-dire qu'ils soient exprimés et qu'ils aient laissé des traces écrites de qui ils ont été et qu'ils se soient définis comme punk. Sinon, on ne voit pas trop comment on peut en parler. Je suis en mesure, a priori, comme je vous l'ai déjà dit, d'aborder le sujet des squats de manière assez complète et détaillée. Donc, si vous avez des questions par la suite, je pourrais tenter d'y répondre. Mais j'ai cherché, évidemment, pour cet exposé, à pas me contenter ce que j'appellerais, pour essayer dans l'image d'un tour du pâté de maison. En gros, si on met les squats punk au milieu, on fait le tour, et puis voilà, on regarde à quoi ils ressemblent de l'extérieur. Je voulais un peu mieux appréhender ce que j'appelle la mixture de la culture punk, de l'attitude et du comportement des punks avec la pratique des squattages, ce que j'appelle des squattages, donc qui englobent toutes les pratiques qui sont liées au phénomène des squats. Dans un environnement paradoxal de solidarité entre squatteurs, de tout milieu, de concurrence aussi, il y a forcément des concurrences entre les groupes politiques, les squatteurs qui sont comme ci, ceux qui sont comme ça, et du coup d'hostilité. Les sources écrites, autrement dit les archives, sont des pièces rares, à moins qu'on ait confirmation par d'autres biais, comme je l'ai dit, d'un étiquetage punk. Et là, je me suis beaucoup servi de littérature, du cinéma et de la musique, évidemment, qui se sont, là j'emploie encore une image, qui sont profilés telles des capsules, un peu que les punks auraient semé pour m'indiquer le chemin pour arriver à un panorama historique des squats punk. En d'autres termes, à partir de quels matériaux enquêter sur les lieux punk, et plus précisément sur les squats punk, sinon en jonglant entre témoignages d'acteurs insolites, souvent velléitaires. Si on va vers quelqu'un sans le connaître, on lui dit « Est-ce que tu peux me raconter comment c'était les punks à l'époque ?» Bah dis non, moi je ne te connais pas, surtout que tu es chercheur. Et subjectivité incontournable de l'historiographie. Évidemment, historien, on est quand même subjectif. Et c'est d'ailleurs pour moi l'une des protagonistes essentielles du présent exposé, parce que c'est pas uniquement par défaut que je propose presque d'identifier les squats punk en éliminant, par élimination de tous les autres squats. Si j'identifie tel squat, plutôt une étiquette squat artiste, squat alternatif, squat zonard, squat toto, etc. Ce qui reste, on pourrait dire que c'est les squats punk, puisqu'ils n'en ont pas forcément l'étiquette. Mais il est bien difficile d'accoler justement cette étiquette punk aussi facilement que ça peut l'être pour un squat de toto, de l'alternos, d'un art ou de zonard. Du coup, la question, je reprends, on a montré hier un extrait de Gérard Holtz qui présentait sur... il me semble qu'il employait justement, qui sont ces oiseaux? C'est un peu la question que je me pose. Est-il scandaleux de chercher à ranger par catégorie des espaces nécessairement fluctuants et hétérogènes? Eh bien non, tenons-nous pour dit, c'est bien dans l'intérêt presque unique de la recherche, qui nous permet ainsi d'en apprendre un peu plus sur l'autre côté des portes d'entrée des squats. Voilà, c'est ce que je vais essayer de faire. Et c'est évidemment absurde d'imaginer que les punks ne se croisent pas dans ces squats-ci, de même que ces squatteurs-là ne se baladent pas à d'autres occasions dans les squats punks. Donc les punks, finalement, ils sont partout. Est-ce qu'il y a des squats punks? C'est ce qu'on va voir. Pour le cas de Paris, donc, une fois qu'il s'est imposé comme une évidence auprès d'une marge grandissante de jeunes gens, le punk, en tant que style, en tant que de musique, en tant que culture, déborde la sphère de la culture avant-gardiste et s'affirme comme une nécessaire conquête de territoire. On l'avait hier dans la salle, il est encore là aujourd'hui. Rémi Pépin écrit à ce sujet dans une histoire de rock alternatif qu'il a intitulée Rebelle. Je le cite: tout au début des squats à Paris, en 1977, Villa Faucheur, rue Piat ou rue Raymond-Losserand, il n'y avait pas beaucoup de punk. Puis petit à petit, avec les concerts gratuits, ils vont s'y mettre de plus en plus. Avec cette citation, on voit un lien qui est assez clair entre la musique et les personnes. Donc a priori, les punks sont nécessairement des personnes qui vont dans les concerts, ou les concerts punk font qu'il y a de plus en plus de punk. Je mettrai une petite nuance à ce qu'il a dit, à savoir que les squats sont apparus à Paris bien avant 1977. Mais ça, je pense qu'il le sait lui-même. En 1977, le phénomène a néanmoins atteint une réelle ampleur et fait régulièrement les gros titres de la presse, notamment parce que les squatteurs sont capables de réunir des foules non négligeables autour de leurs revendications. Et parce qu'ils s'imposent également comme des nouvelles formes du militantisme politique et de la vie communautaire à l'échelle urbaine. C'est l'époque d'or de ce que j'appellerais, ou ce qui est appelé aussi ailleurs, la galaxie autonome. Selon Rémi Pépin, c'est la multiplication des concerts qui va grossir la vague punk au sein des squats parisiens. Selon Arnaud Rootboy, autre musicien de l'époque et auteur d'un non moins précieux témoignage au titre plus encore symbolique, Nyark Nyark, il y a effectivement une convergence des intérêts culturels, économiques et politiques, liés au plaisir diogénique de déranger en provoquant. Je le cite. Du coup, l'équation devient très simple. On met d'un côté une absence quasiment totale de lieux où peuvent se produire les groupes, et de l'autre, des lieux qui proposent des salles de concert avec un esprit alternatif. La nature a horreur du vide, le punk aussi, et c'est tout naturellement que les squats parisiens vont devenir le lieu de rencontre des sphères punk rock et militantes. L'autonomie va jouer le rôle de branche politique du rock. Après l'expérience de Rock Against Police, développée en marge du mouvement antiraciste et d'organisations représentatives de la parole des immigrés, notamment autour du magazine Sans Frontières, qui était basé dans le quartier de la Goutte d'Or, les groupes de musique punk sillonnent les UJC de banlieue, ont parfois la chance de passer au Gibus, au Rose Bonbon, au Goldsoro, puis échouent au Malfamé des vilains. Celui-là même que le groupe Berruret Noir a décrit dans un hommage plein de tendresse dans sa chanson Ainsi squatte-t-il. Je vous remémore les paroles, j'ai pas l'extrait musical, mais... te souviens-tu encore de ce petit bar squatté? On n'a pas eu tort de l'appeler le Malfamé. Voilà, le Malfamé, donc. Oula, 5 minutes. Je vais faire très très vite alors. Belleville est certainement le berceau du punk parisien. Et donc, le Malfamé, c'est un bar donc, qui est aménagé dans un terrain vague dans la rue Villain, qui a aujourd'hui été amputé de 3/4 pour construire le joli parc de Belleville. Il faut savoir donc, qu'à Belleville regroupe à l'époque, comme je dis, donc, il y a le parc de Belleville qui a été construit depuis. C'est un espace qui est en pleine rénovation urbaine et du coup, en attendant que tous ces vieux immeubles qui se délabrent soient détruits, ça fait un potentiel d'investigation pour des personnes qui ont qui ont des projets ou qui simplement profitent du fait qu'il est facile finalement d'y entrer et qu'on les laisse tranquilles puisque il y a assez peu les projets de rachat sont pas finis. Donc Belleville, c'est un quartier qui concentre énormément de squats à l'époque. Il développe beaucoup de choses, et là je vais citer un extrait du numéro 0 du label de cassette Visa, Passeport pour l'exportation. Qui compile donc, des extraits de concerts. Et entre-temps, il y a les interviews de squatteurs de l'époque. Donc je vais en citer un extrait. On est venu à 2, mais il y a plein de copains qui se pointent. C'est normal, on va habiter ensemble. Il y a plein d'appartements, c'est super. Bon, il y a peut-être du boulot à faire, de la plomberie à refaire un peu, parce que les lavabos ils se cassent la gueule, ou qu'il y a, je sais pas. Il y en a qui sont venus récupérer quelques interrupteurs, quelques prises, pour faire tout ça, on bricole. Il nous faut aussi une salle boxon pour ceux qui veulent s'éclater, une salle poulos pour ceux qui veulent se reposer un peu. Qu'est-ce qu'il nous faut? Évidemment une douche, très important. On dit qu'on est sale, on dit qu'on se lave jamais et tout, faut pas croire. Il y a des douches, il y a de l'eau chaude, pas souvent mais ça arrive. Il y a de l'eau chaude, il y a tout. Il y a une salle commune pour discuter, pour que les gens viennent. Bon, on s'organise quoi. On organise notre vie, c'est à 4 étages, 5 étages, 2 étages, une usine en profondeur, n'importe quel sens, on l'aménage comme on veut et comme on l'aime quoi. C'est le principal quoi. Les squats sont donc, de toute évidence, des lieux d'action politique et de sociabilité, ce qui ne dédouane pas de l'image criminelle qui les entoure. Je vais du coup vite sauter à Berlin-Ouest, en enchaînant sur le fait que voilà, on leur prête bien des choses aux punks, et du coup, il y a un imaginaire répressif qui va se développer autour de l'image que donnent les punks à voir d'eux-mêmes, et qui va, d'une certaine manière, faciliter un peu faciliter ou qui va être exploité par la partie adverse, évidemment, à savoir le milieu politique, municipal et évidemment la police. On présente, et la presse qui va beaucoup contribuer à entretenir cette image. On les présente toujours dans des conditions d'habitat pires qu'insalubres, à la limite du scabreux, et régulièrement les gros titres s'attardent toujours sur des photos, voilà. Les squats qui sont réputés aussi abriter des punks sont autrement dit des ruines et qui auraient deux fonctions principales. Offrir un lieu où s'adonner en toute tranquillité à l'usage de toutes les drogues et permettre aux consommateurs de rester sur place à défaut d'autres toits. Il y a un classique de la littérature pour qui s'intéresse aux drogues, c'est le témoignage de Christiane F., 13 ans, droguée, prostituée, voilà. Il écrit en 76, je crois, cet ouvrage. Et il donne déjà à voir un peu le milieu squatter de l'époque à Berlin-Ouest, mais justement un peu l'autre côté de ce que je viens de voir pour le cas parisien, c'est-à-dire l'espace de sociabilité avec l'organisation de concerts, mais plutôt qui a aussi existé à Paris, hein, mais là j'ai pas eu le temps d'en parler, donc j'ai sauté là-dessus. Mais les punks à Berlin, ils vont aussi avoir cette image plus organisée. Rémi Pépin posait hier la question du chaos organisé. À Berlin-Ouest, après quelques épisodes à rebondissement, c'est le lieu par excellence où cohabite toute une frange de la contre-culture, et de toutes les contre-cultures et autres non-cultures. Évidemment, on a parlé ce matin avec la personne qui parlait de Die Doris, de la situation politique et géopolitique de Berlin, qui est très particulière et qui va contribuer beaucoup à développer toute cette scène des milieux squatteurs. Depuis 78-79, à la suite de l'automne noir, la scène alternative s'est démultipliée, laissant éclore les fleurs des projets écolos, de l'autogestion en entreprise, de la solidarité de quartier, etc. Et c'est là-dessus que va se construire la scène des squats. Au départ, les premiers squats à Berlin, c'est vraiment en réaction justement à tous ces projets de rénovation urbaine qui ont lieu en fait dans toutes les villes en Europe à l'époque, hein, années 70, début des années 80. Et puis évidemment, ça va être investi par plein de projets politiques, notamment encore une fois les autonomes. Et c'est là qu'on voit aussi apparaître des punks. Et alors là, il y a une anecdote qui est un peu rigolote. Il faut savoir qu'à Berlin, l'architecture typique, c'est des maisons avec des ailes et puis un bâtiment dans l'arrière-cour. Donc ce qui en fait le numéro de la rue, il va être unique pour tous ces bâtiments qui sont du coup énormes. Et quand on dit à Paris qu'il y a eu à peu près 200 squats, l'apogée de la période au début des années 80, quand on dit à Berlin qu'il y a 200 squats, voilà, à Paris c'est parfois quelques appartements dans un immeuble. À Berlin, 200 squats, c'est un numéro d'adresse, donc ça regroupe une quantité de personnes qui est énorme. Et alors ce qui est rigolo, c'est que quelquefois, la première maison, elle est occupée par des squatteurs qui vont être artistes par exemple, ou qui vont avoir des projets vraiment alternatifs, etc. Et l'aile de derrière va être occupée par des punks, qui vont du coup un peu saboter le travail justement de bonne image, etc. Et en même temps, ce qui est rigolo aussi à Berlin, et qui est je pense assez particulier pour la scène de Berlin-Ouest, on va retrouver des punks un peu dans tous les types de squats, et qui vont en fait participer aussi au développement de toute une frange qui va chercher à négocier avec le Sénat. Donc Berlin-Ouest est dirigé par un Sénat, il n'y a pas de maire de la ville, mais c'est donc un Sénat, qui vont négocier pour obtenir des contrats d'occupation. Et les punks en fait vont être investis en tant que groupe parfois pour négocier des contrats d'occupation et qui vont même cotiser aussi pour parfois même pour racheter le bâtiment en disant voilà, nous on a une politique de logement alternative, on va plutôt que de raser l'immeuble, nous on propose de le rénover, etc. Je vais conclure là-dessus et je vais du coup j'avais encore plein de choses à dire, je pensais m'être minuté parfaitement. Je vais conclure là-dessus, mais j'espère qu'il y aura des questions qui permettront d'aborder toutes les autres choses que j'avais prévu d'aborder. Merci.
Merci. Comme il y a une belle unité thématique avec cet atelier, on va garder le débat pour la fin, comme ça on pourra avoir des réponses collectives à vos questions. Et je cède tout de suite la parole à Michael Stewart Farley de l'Université de Groningen, qui va nous parler de la chaîne de San Francisco. Alors, peut-être ce qu'on va faire, c'est faire passer Daniel juste après, comme ça, pour les questions logistiques. On n'aura pas, vu que Marc doit... Donc, so you guys you'll follow up right after Michael.
Okay. Should I wait till that gets fired up? Yeah. While we're waiting for that, let me just say thanks to the conference organizers, the two Pauls and Elodie, because I think it's been an amazing conference. I come from a discipline and from a department I used to work in where my interest in punk wasn't so warmly welcomed, so it warms my heart to be in a room full of people who think this is a perfectly legitimate thing to study. I imagine that most people at a conference like this, particularly those concerned with the question of punk politics, will be aware that Dead Kennedys lead singer Jello Biafra ran for mayor of San Francisco in 1979. Still, I suspect that most of you might regard it as more of a political stunt, a prank, than as a serious political engagement. But that's what it was. An earnest, if sometimes wise-assed, intervention in mainstream politics. Biafra, here on the steps of City Hall in a campaign event, won more than 6,000 votes, which was nearly 4% of the vote, in a city where punks numbered only in the hundreds. Thousands of San Franciscans voted for him, not merely because he proposed that businessmen be required to wear clown suits, or that the city establish a more transparent board of bribery to establish standardized rates for liquor licenses, building codes, and police protection, but also because he proposed more serious solutions to problems ailing the city, such as banning cars from downtown, making police subject to yes or no confidence votes by the people living in the neighborhoods in which they patrolled, and legalizing squatting in vacant buildings. I start with Biafra's campaign because it's what most people don't realize, including a lot of San Francisco punks from the period, is that by 1979, a punk running for mayor was a logical outcome of years of fighting City Hall and real estate developers over issues like housing and police repression. But you might not know it because San Francisco's punk scene has been so totally overshadowed by London's, New York's, Los Angeles's, and even Washington, D.C.'s, I would say. And because historians of the 1970s and 1980s, my peers, have so totally missed or misread American punk. In fact, it's fair to say that historians of American political culture in the 70s and 80s have a punk rock problem. They either ignore it entirely, which is part of a general pattern of ignoring youth politics altogether after the 1960s, as if young people stopped being politically active after the fall of Saigon or something. Or, if they do acknowledge its existence, it's only to dismiss punk outright as a kind of flash-in-the-pan fad. To take one representative example, in Bruce Schulman's Popular History of the United States in the 1970s, he scorns American punk for lacking British punk's, quote, political edge, and singles out one of the most politically engaged American punk bands, Dead Kennedys, as being interested only in, quote, flouting established notions of good taste. So, when historians bother to pay attention to 70s punks, it's only to characterize them the way that the media did at the time, as posers who merely gestured toward political engagement as cover for a depraved commitment to transgression for transgression's sake. As you can tell, I find it difficult to forgive this kind of institutional ignorance or willful blindness, particularly since cultural studies scholars have shown for decades so clearly that young people's political experience in this period was increasingly tied to the arts, especially music and performance. Those same cultural studies scholars who work on the United States have a bad habit of overstating the impossibility of political protest in this period, when in fact the nation saw far more grassroots politics than is generally acknowledged. And they tend not to examine punk's political engagement beyond Dick Hebdage's original argument that punk was a, quote, oblique challenge to hegemony. So the purpose of this paper is to use the case of San Francisco, the city we perhaps associate most with the 60s counterculture, to examine the politics of punk a decade later, in the late 70s. The San Francisco punk experience very much fits the conference sub-theme of commitment and provocation, and its binary of politics or posing, or in the binary of politics or posing, comes down clearly on the side of politics. So I make several interrelated arguments. First is that San Francisco punks earnestly, perhaps naively, committed themselves to political and social engagement. Through their music, their visual art, their zine writing, through their solidarity with other communities of the oppressed in the city, punks worked for real, measurable political change, not unlike one would expect from social movement organizers. I believed we were going to change the world, an editor of one zine later said to me in a refrain that dozens of people have said to me in oral history interviews. Second, although San Francisco punks raised in the crucible of 60s political ferment, assassinations, Vietnam, Chicago, Kent State, etc., expressed cynicism toward the countercultural and political radicals who had once been their heroes, in many ways they continued to follow their examples. And as I'll show in particular, that's true with the New Left and with the Yippies. Third, and related, San Francisco punks dedicated themselves to building a politically engaged community that was, to use the sociologist Winnie Bryness's term, prefigurative, a kind of micro-model of the kind of America they wanted to see. And part of that micro-model involved a performative music experience that, whether on vinyl or from the stage of any number of small venues, not only qualified as political, but, if you can believe it, as utopian. And I'll come back to that. It's especially useful to examine punk in San Francisco because there's a clear connection, easily charted from the Beats through the New Left and the counterculture to punk. But also because the San Francisco punk scene, as I say, has been almost completely overshadowed by these other punk scenes. And I was talking to somebody yesterday about the Clear Beat connection. Vale, who founded Search and Destroy, got $200 from Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and he worked at City Lights, which was down the street from the Mabuhay Gardens, the main San Francisco club at the time, punk club at the time. And there's no question in my mind that San Francisco punks established the most politically engaged punk scene in the United States. No other scene had the concentration of bands that specialized in political critiques and anthems. Long before Dead Kennedys come along, there are bands like the Dills, who had songs like I Hate the Rich and Class War, which I feel obligated to play a bit of. It's not playing.
Yeah, it's good.
Hold on. I think we're missing something. Let's do this.
Put up the sound up.
Wait, record.
Good boy.
No. Ideally, we'd clear the chairs.
That's better.
I have a bunch of sound files. I can't play all the songs because I'll go way over. But it's worth noting that there's this reference about if I'm told to kill a Cuban or African, there'll be a class war right here in America. And that's a direct reference, speaking in the zine panel earlier, to all this stuff that was being written in Search and Destroy about Rhodesia and the possibility of bringing back the draft, right, and going to war against Cuban armies that have been successful in Angola, and we're going to be moving into Rhodesia. There's other bands like the Avengers. If you know anything about San Francisco punk beyond Dead Kennedys, you may know this song. stop. The Avengers, I'm thinking of naming the book We Are the One, so that song is really important to me. But the Avengers wrote a whole bunch of songs that are fiercely political and kind of anthemic like that, right? And then there's all these other bands that you may not have heard of, like Negative Trend, the Nuns, the Mutants, UXA, which stood for United Experiments of America, Flipper. They all wrote songs that were expressly political, and it was almost a kind of challenge to them when they formed bands that the songs they needed to write, because of how the scene had established itself, had to be political. And I forgot Frightwig, which is sort of feminist punk, proto Riot Girl stuff, you know, like 15 years before Riot Girl. No other punk scene saw punks holding benefit concerts for Kentucky miners, for example. They raised more than $3,000 for miners striking in Harlan County, Kentucky. For striking railway workers, this is about 6 months later. See the Dills, the Mutants, the Dead Kennedys. For the falsely convicted Black Panther, Geronimo Pratt. For the No on 6 campaign, this is the referendum that was going to ban homosexuals from teaching in California schools. Harvey Milk was the supervisor in San Francisco, who was the most outspoken opponent, and he emceed this event at the Mabuhay Gardens with a number of bands, some of whom were totally straight or totally gay or mixed, and it got, I think it's a great poster, right? Save the Homos benefit. And New Wave Against Oppression, right? When New Wave was still being used kind of interchangeably with punk. Beyond that, there were benefits for the city's Gay Day Parade, for anti-draft organizations, for the defense of Desi Woods, who was a woman who was sentenced to 22 years in prison for killing her rapist with his own gun. So it's this remarkable range of political issues, some of which were related to life in San Francisco, but many of which were important beyond the city. And I was thinking, I didn't include this in the paper, but in the zines, there, Search and Destroy had the column every issue called The Politics of Punk. And they had that same obsession that Matt Worley was talking about with the Red Brigades and the Red Army faction, for example. But closer to home, punks were on the front lines of the city's housing wars and battles against police repression, literally fighting street battles. In the 1970s, thanks to soaring inflation and municipal policy making that privileged real estate interests over human concerns, San Francisco became no city for old men or women. Young people could double, triple, quadruple up in an apartment, but the elderly were being squeezed out by the wrecking ball to make way for high-rises and condominiums. This is the International Hotel, that building in the foreground, which you can see has the Transamerica Pyramid sort of bearing down on it. And in 1977, this is only just a few blocks from the Mabuhay Gardens. This becomes the kind of epicenter of the tenants' war that takes place in San Francisco in 1977. The International Hotel was a residential hotel that housed maybe a couple hundred Asian, mostly Filipino tenants who paid less than $80 a month for their rooms. But the International Hotel owners sold it to real estate developers and started evicting people. There were 40 holdouts or so, and then frequent protests outside the building until the night of August 4th, 1977, when the police arrived in the middle of the night. Here you see them, sort of on the edges of the image, to find thousands of protesters, including dozens of the city's punks, defending the building. Who were no match ultimately for the robo-cops who kind of plowed through them, mounted a tactical military assault on the building, escorted the elderly prisoners of war out before the television cameras into the street, and then went back in and smashed the place so that it couldn't be occupied afterwards, right? It was a complete disgrace, but it established the city's punks as willing to make common cause with anybody else in the city who was being oppressed. And then punks go on to stand up for a number of other anti-eviction efforts as well in the ensuing years. That's kind of the Lexington and Concord of the housing war. Similarly, when the verdict came down in the Dan White trial, Dan White's the guy who assassinated George Moscone and Harvey Milk, right, in cold-blooded murder, but he was sentenced only, or convicted only of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. punks were the ones who led the riot at City Hall that made it look more like Paris in 1968 than San Francisco in 1979. In contrast to the night that Milk and Moscone had been killed, in which there was a march of 40,000 people out of the Castro to City Hall that remained entirely peaceful, when the verdict came down, a number of the punks have talked to me about this, including many of the gay punks, said that there wasn't going to be a peaceful march this time. And that he and about a dozen other punks who were gay and straight were among the first ones, including members of the Avengers and of Negative Trend, to set the cars on fire, the police cars on fire. This is the famous image on the cover of Dead Kennedy's first record, of police cars burning outside of City Hall, and were the first ones to throw bricks and stones through City Hall's windows. Now, beyond these high-profile street battles, the punks followed in their 60s forerunners' footsteps by building a community that was, as I mentioned, prefigurative and, on some level, utopian. Now, I know what you're thinking, how could punk, an art form supposedly defined by its nihilism, be utopian? To get there, we have to overcome the conventional wisdom that punks were cynical to a fault, content to kick America when it was down, radical posers. Oh, shit. Really?
You're a real punk.
Okay. I'm going to regroup.
2-minute margin.
Yeah, 2-minute margin. Okay, thanks. So the point is, we have to overcome the conventional wisdom about punks being radical posers for whom radicalism was just another way of transgressing button-down conservative America, right? For one thing, the DIY ethos that we've heard so much about this weekend was central to the prefigurative politics in San Francisco. Not only did bands, venues, radio shows, zines operate beyond the influence of media corporations, but they built an infrastructure for a participatory culture and a radical critique that ailed America. The prefigurative community that they built was one that was built so that everyone could participate equally. And the San Francisco scene is notable for its diversity. Although it was mostly white, like most American punk, the Black, Latino, and Asian punks were not mere token presences. And like Los Angeles, San Francisco stood out for the tremendous number of women and gays playing in bands, running zines, and being among the best writers, photographers, and organizers. The influence of the New Left was apparent in tackling concrete issues, as I say, about housing and police repression. And in the larger work, I make reference to Paul Potter, who was the head of Students for a Democratic Society in 1965, who gave a speech that talked about the Vietnam War, but talked about the need to name the system that made the war possible. Punks in San Francisco basically practiced the same thing, about naming the system as their primary tactic, to cut through the bullshit, as they so often said, to become researchers and reporters, sounding alarms in their songs and in their zines, naming the various corrupt systems and spreading the word to the wider community. Dead Kennedys provide two obvious examples. One is in a song that I won't actually play for you, but Let's Lynch the Landlord comes out of this context of the housing wars, right? And it's a direct reference as well to Dianne Feinstein, the mayor, who was often likened to Margaret Thatcher, who was herself a landlord, and what the sheriff of the San Francisco County once called a cop groupie, right? So here's Let's Lynch the Landlord, which makes reference to a landlord who says, you're going to help me buy City Hall. Later in Police Truck is the song about the police, which came directly from the news reports of Oakland cops who would go around and pick up prostitutes and rape them in the back of the van, right? So these are just two examples of very many that I could cite about naming the system that was total and oppressive. For Dead Kennedys, it also included this kind of yippie performance style, right? Even though they don't make self-reference to it, there's a famous case of Dead Kennedys being invited, sort of foolishly, to play this event called the BAMIs, which was like a Bay Area Grammys award show. And maybe you know this story. You can hear the actual live recording of it is on the compilations record, Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. But they came out supposedly to play California Uber Alice, and they came out looking very buttoned down. And then about 10 seconds into the song, Biafra waves them off. They pull their ties down to make these dollar signs, and they start playing this song that they wrote just for this occasion called Pull My Strings, right? About basically selling your soul so that you can play rock and roll. And the real pièce de résistance is that by the end of the song, the second time he comes around to the second chorus, he gets the entire audience of the Warfield Theater, like people like Bill Graham and Jerry Garcia and Santana and the guys from Journey, and everybody's singing, "Is my cock big enough? Is my brain small enough for you to make me a star?" Right? You have to hear the recording because it's hilarious. Yeah, that's basically the same thing as Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman dumping $1 bills on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange so that trading stops as everyone scrambles to pick up the $1 bills. Right? It's a kind of political pie throwing that I think is really important. Well, let me just get to the last part because I'm going to run out of time any second. Is that I make this case as well for punk and 60s style utopia via the theater scholar Jill Dolan, who has suggested, here it is, in a different context, she was writing about radical one-woman theater performances, that audiences gather, quote, hoping perhaps for moments of transformation that might let them consider and change the world outside. The desire in punk in San Francisco to be, the way that Dolan describes it, part of the intense present of a throbbing, pulsating, sweaty crowd at any one of these venues in the city, offered the audience, if not expressly political, then usefully emotional expressions of what utopia might feel like. In making her case, Dolan uses this definition of utopia from Roland Scher, and I like it too. Utopia, he wrote, one might say, is the measure of how far a society can retreat from itself when it wants to feign what it would like to become. So to apply Dolan's utopian performative analysis to San Francisco punk, we have to accept her notion that to enact an ideal future, a culture has to move farther and farther away from the real into a kind of performative. Maybe that performance did not necessarily bring about the desired utopia, but it inspired perhaps other more local doings that sketched out the potential in those feignings. And certainly for me, San Francisco punks were by 1979 inspiring many other more local doings. I don't, at the same time, want to overstate the case. It's true that San Francisco punks did not offer some systematic vision of what a utopian America might look like. They were not SDS writing a new Port Huron statement. But the music that brought punks together in 1978, 79, 80 provided a chance to think through the ills ailing America, to process the horrors that afflicted San Francisco, to talk it out the way one might with a therapist, with all the anger, sadness, pathos, humor, and exhilaration that flowed naturally. The utopia that Dead Kennedys and other bands were slinging was a place of truth. It was a place where beasts in the form of illegitimate authority doing wrong were named, a place where not only the bands, but you, the fan, the peer, the fellow critic, cut through the, quote, bullshit that seemed to dominate American life. One could argue for a new left lineage, that Paul Potter in Naming the System, and a yippie style, but what was different was the combination of message and music, lifting the audience through headphones or live performance to moments marked by possibility. Thank you.
Michael. So for logistics reasons, we're going to keep on going with Daniel McAgan from DePaul University. Home is where the heart is. Do-it-yourself punk house shows in the USA.
Thank you. I'm just going to get this going. All right, my name is Daniel McAgan. I'm from DePaul University in Chicago, and today I will, sorry for the French speakers, we're going to do 2 English back-to-back. For the non-English speakers, it's 40 minutes straight of daydreaming. For everyone else, I guess, it's a lot of work, but it's logistical, right? So today I will talk a little bit about early show spaces in the US, some theories of public life and public space, and then the bulk of the presentation, my talk today, will focus on house shows as pseudo-public space, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. So if we think about DIY touring, do-it-yourself touring in the US, Some early spaces where bands would play would be places like community halls, so VFW halls like Veterans of Foreign Wars, Elks Lodges, loft spaces, art galleries, public parks, that sort of thing. The spaces tended to be used for local shows, so punks all around the United States were inspired by what they were finding in the late 70s, especially in the early 80s, and they wanted to start doing local shows. They formed punk bands, and punk bands wanted to play out. And so they would book these shows in these kinds of places. Some bands toured nationally. So if you think about a book like Michael Ozerod's This Band Could Be Your Life, he talked a lot about Black Flag and the Replacements and Husker Du. Those are bigger bands, right? So Black Flag is seen as kind of like the gold standard of DIY punk touring in the 80s, but that truly is the gold standard. A lot of local bands weren't doing that. They were just playing regionally, and they were playing in these kind of halls. So touring, as I'll talk about a little later, I don't think really gets going for small bands until the early 1990s. So here we have examples of a VFW hall, a Minor Threat flyer for a VFW hall, and playing with the big boys. That would have been an amazing show to see, huh? And in the upper right-hand corner, you have Black Flag playing a VFW hall in Kansas City. So what would happen is local kids usually, or people in their early 20s, would rent these halls, and then the bands would come and play, and punks would dance and have a good time. And I'll say something more about these halls in 1 second. So in terms of some theories of public life, just to like bracket for a second to kind of theorize what's happening in the United States, there are a number of theorists who have talked about a dearth of public life and public space in the United States. So in other words, the Parisian cafes or the UK pubs or the Latin American marketplaces don't exist in the United States. The United States, especially with the rise of suburbanization, becomes very isolated and very spread apart. There's not the sense of public life. And obviously with the rise of suburbanization, you get bigger houses, bigger spaces, so people can socialize in those places. Robert Putnam wrote this book, Bowling Alone, and in just the theory is that we see a decrease in bowling leagues, that people still bowl, but they bowl on their own. They don't join leagues because they don't want to interact with strangers in the United States. And he says that what we end up seeing is a loss of social capital, in other words, networks of trust that are formed among public citizens in public spaces in the form of public life. Robert Oldenburg gives us a spatial complement to this analysis. Oldenburg, in his book, The Great Good Place, talked about third places, so these informal spaces of public life, like I just mentioned, cafes, pubs, markets, that sort of thing. And Richard Sennett also wrote a great book called The Conscience of the Eye that was about a similar idea, that historicized it a lot more. And so the gist of all of their argument is that what's happened in the United States is people have moved inward. So all of the social activity happens in one's house. So what does that mean? You only get together with friends and family members, you don't interact with strangers, okay? So I want to reframe that notion of the house as a pseudo-public space when punks use their homes, usually that they're renting, or their apartments as spaces to see punk bands. Okay, so in theory, the VFW hall is a space of public life. This is a public space, a city-owned space that people can come and they can do shows. But the problem is that for the public park is also a public space, that anyone can, in theory, get access to a park and host a punk show. But the problem with this is that punks often experience problems. Go figure, punks experiencing problems. So there's a number of different problems. So for example, and by the way, I should have said this up front, this is part of a book that I'm 2 weeks away from finishing that's about DIY spaces in the United States. And so one of the guys that I interviewed, this guy Josh Otten, who co-founded a house in Iowa called FSU Garage. The bands played in the garage of the house. when he first got into punk, him and his friends were in a place called Marshalltown, Iowa, a super small little town. For those of you who are into hardcore, if you know the band Modern Life is War, you may know this band Marshalltown, that's the town. And so they did shows in this place called the Coliseum, which was like a city center, right? It had a gymnasium, a basketball court, a bunch of little rooms where, and then punks would rent this and they would do shows there. But they had to rent the space for $150. So that means you have to make $150 from the door before you can even start to pay your touring bands some kind of money to be able to get in and out of the town, and ideally if you want to pay your local band something. So, and then if you have to rent a sound person to run sound as well, maybe that's another $50 to bring in a PA system. So it gets very expensive, so they switched to a public park. But then the people who were in the public park, which you could rent for $35 much cheaper, they didn't like punk shows in the public park. Again, go figure, punk's having problems. And so this is a common kind of story. So these spaces of public life don't actually work for public life. And the people who are in charge of these spaces are constantly concerned about punks. So if something goes wrong, like somebody breaks a sink in a bathroom, no more punk shows. But if you have a retirement party and some drunk 65-year-old smashes the sink, they're not going to stop doing retirement parties, but they will stop doing punk shows, right? So punks need an alternative, and here's where the house comes in. Because you're already paying your rent to rent a house, why not have punk shows in the house as well when you're a punk, right? When you're a punk, you have to be very creative about how you use the space. So punks start doing shows in their houses. And so what develops in the 1990s really is a whole touring network where bands can find out about houses where they can play and they can tour the country. So let me stop and say a couple different things. One is that, first of all, lots of punks could play bars, right, or clubs. But what are bars and clubs there to do? They're there to make money off of alcohol primarily. They don't care about punk. So one night, even the most famous punk clubs, like when I lived in New York in the early 1990s, maybe there was a punk band at CBGB's one night, but the next night was like, you know, local horrible band night. And the next night was rented out by a major label so PJ Harvey could play. And then the next night was something else. CBGB's has no investment in punk. CBGB's has investment in selling alcohol and getting door money, right? So for punks at a DIY level, the idea is how do we keep the economy within punk? And I'm sure there's a lot of connections to squatting. I just unfortunately don't speak any French, so we'll have to chat afterwards with the translator. So, but the idea, right, is how do you keep the economy within punk? So this whole network emerges in the 1990s where bands can tour all around the country and they can play houses. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing is how does this work, okay? So in the Midwest, I live in Chicago now, most houses have basements. So the bands play in the basement or the cellar. Like I grew up in Los Angeles, there are no basements in Los Angeles. So in Southern California, for example, the bands play in the living room or in the kitchen, in the house. Sometimes they play in the backyard. And so the band will come and they'll play the house, and usually the price to get in is $5 to $7 kind of sliding scale. And if the show is run well, someone stands at the door and collects the money, and all of that money goes to the touring bands. So if you have $5 a person and 50 people show up, that's $250 US that punk band just got. They would never make that size band would never make $250 playing a bar, never. Because they won't be able to bring out that many people, and it's all ages. Some houses are BYOB houses. In other words, you bring your own beer, maybe you bring your own weed, you bring your own whatever. Some houses, though, are sober houses. That means no drinking, no drugs at all, okay? And so these are kind of how the houses function, and I'll say more about that in a second. The other interesting thing is that the house materializes DIY. In other words, we can talk a lot about what DIY means, but this is a material example, a material space that's used for the purposes of DIY punk, and people gather for the sole purposes of punk, and to support a punk economy and to be with other punks, versus, once again, a club where one night it's indie rock night, one night it's punk night, one night it's alternative country night, okay? That's not necessarily part of a DIY punk scene. And then also people learn what it means to be and do punk in this space, right? And I'll talk a little bit more in the end, if I have time, about alternative methods that people learn to do and be a punk. But to be able to do that together, once again, to materialize DIY, I think is really important. And then in terms of how bodies experience the space. So I've got 2 videos that I'm going to show you of different house shows. And so the first video that I will show you is, where did you go, my friend? Is Raw Nerve, which is a hardcore band that, what happened there?
Nothing. Nothing happened.
Yeah,
Like,
that's weird.
technical problems again.
Let's see if Joyce Maynard comes up. What are you guys seeing now? Nothing.
Nothing.
Vey.
Anything to do with your computer? Those are my sound files on my desktop.
Yeah, that's the only thing we see, so I guess.
What about the preferences? Screen preferences.
Screen preferences?
Screen preferences, change the format, and normally it sorts out the problem. In my experience from the same computer.
Yeah.
Displays?
Yes, exactly. This scale.
Scale?
Scale.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't do anything. If you move it to scale. Voilà. Here you go.
All right.
Céline, IT specialist.
Sorry. Sorry, y'all. I promise I won't cut into anyone else's time.
Okay, but then can you move it on the on your monitor? Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, Lord. That is weird. There's a button usually that will just mirror it. All right.
No,
Go the other way.
the other way.
Bring it back.
Seriously? All right, I gotta look up
Now
here.
it's
All right, it's all right. So this is Raw Nerve from Chicago. It's their last show. It's a house called the Mousetrap. Kill some light. So this is a hardcore band, as you're about to find out. Okay, so as you can tell from seeing that, it's fairly chaotic, but it's also very communal. It's very different than the kind of 1980s model of what was happening in places like New York and Boston, where basically people were going to fight and the soundtrack was a punk show. This is very kind of communal space, but it's also very machismo kind of space too. You don't see a lot of women in the front. Oh Lord. Okay, so let me play you now something very different, which is a band called Joyce Maynard. which is a pop punk band. This is so funny.
If you gather windows, it helps.
Yeah. So you'll see a very different kind of scene here. And this is a house in Garden Grove, which is in Southern California, Orange County. Joyce Maynard's a pop punk band, and they're playing in the living room. Let me just say, I think what's really important is to look at the bodies in the space, how the bodies interact, how tight the band and the folks are together. You don't have bands up on a stage, you don't have a light show. Everyone's body is jammed together as one. It feels amazing. No bouncers standing in front of a stage. People can literally sing with the band, not sing along with the band, but sing with the band. So, okay, so you can see that in terms of how people are using the space, I won't even mess with my PowerPoint anymore, I apologize. I'm gonna be quick, I'm gonna finish in like 2 more minutes. I'll be ahead of schedule, maybe. Maybe not. So the thing is that the bodies in the space really matter because, again, people learn how to be and do punk. They control the economy of the space. They control how the space functions. It's very much a space for punk. There are all kinds of other issues, though. That, in other words, when you live in the house, your space, your private space now becomes a public space, a pseudo-public space. And this can wear and tear on a lot of punks who have an idea of punk being a kind of public experience. But at some point, you don't want a bunch of punks in your basement, right? You want to have your own space. And at some point, you need a break from a punk show in your house. So you're giving a lot to a scene when you open up your house to be a punk house. And for that reason, punk houses don't last very long. They usually last at most 1.5 years, 2 years. It's rare. There are some houses that have lasted 10, 15 years. Lost Cross House in Carbondale, Illinois has lasted for 25 years. That's very rare. Usually it's 1 year, 1.5 years because the people who are living in the houses are in their early 20s and they decide they want to get married and they want to have kids and they want to get a real job and they want to have real stuff. And they don't want all their stuff destroyed, which is what happens in punks. So the houses tend to burn out and fade away. The police show up in some instances, and so people feel pressure from the police, and the landlords threaten to evict them because the landlords feel pressure from the police. The houses that tend to last the longest are in university districts, in college towns, because those towns are just crazy and loud at all times, and the police can't distinguish between a fraternity party and a punk show. It's all just loud noise, and they don't care. Or they do care, and they break it up. So I had some flyers I was going to show you that tied to the notion that when I said that Raw Nerve Show was chaotic but very communal, you'll see things on every single flyer, even if it's a BYOB show. If it's not, it'll say no drugs, no alcohol, and then something funny, like no jerks, no tomfoolery, no cops. But if it's a BYOB house, it will still say, it will have some explicit statement about no jerks, no homophobia, no sexist bullshit allowed in this space. So I had those flyers that I was going to be able to show you as a way that kind of this space embodies the rise of identity politics in the 1990s. And I will stop there. Thank you.
So, you oppose retired people